All right, thank you. So my name's Peter Clark. I'm at the Allen Institute for AI. We've been working on a very different type of question. So these are science questions that pose significantly different challenges to the kind of factoid questions which people have talked about earlier. I'm going to describe some of our work to address those. So first, a quick motivation, then I have to wake you up after lunch, a quick quiz to see if you're as smart as a fourth grader. And then I'm going to talk about two pieces of work we've done to answer these questions, one looking at using rules and one using tables. So our goal at AI2 is not specifically to pass exams or answer exam questions. The big picture is to create what I like to call knowledgeable machines. That is, machines that have some deep understanding of the world and can provide reasoning and explanation for the questions that are given to it. That's the big AI goal. Our focus has been to get a starting point, is to look at elementary science as a domain, and our challenge task has been to pass science exams exactly as written. Currently we're working on the fourth grade exam and expanding up to 8th grade. So this is exams for 10-year-olds and 14-year-olds. So what do these questions look like? Are these questions you can answer? So here's a quick 4-question quiz so you can see what sort of questions come up. So have your pencils ready. Here's the first question. Which object is the best conductor of electricity? A wax crayon, a plastic spoon, a rubber eraser, or an iron nail? And so, of course, the answer is an iron nail. So this is actually quite an easy question for a computer. Information retrieval methods would probably work quite well. If you do a Google search for iron nail conducts electricity, you'll find a lot of statements on the web that says iron nails do indeed conduct electricity, or iron conducts electricity, or metals conduct electricity. So this is a question which is reasonably amenable to information retrieval. Here's a question 2. This is a bit more difficult for a machine. 4th graders are planning a roller skate race. Which surface would be best for this race? Gravel, sand, blacktop, or grass? And of course the answer is blacktop. So this is a question where information retrieval methods do fail. There is no statement on the web that says blacktop is a good surface for roller skating. You might think that we could use some statistical methods like co-occurrence statistics to look for an answer option which is very strongly correlated or co-occurring with words in the question. When we do that, we actually find the word gravel and graders is very strongly correlated because of statements like this. Graders are commonly used in the construction of gravel roads. And even if we ignore the word sense problem, there's also very strong correlations between grass, which is the wrong answer, and race, and gravel, which is also the wrong answer, and surface. So again, this is a good question which shows some of the challenges. Really, for a computer to answer this question, it needs some understanding about the topic and some knowledge about the world. For example, a possible chain of reasoning might be roller skating requires a smooth surface, knowing that blacktop has a smooth surface, and then the ability to put those two together and say, therefore, blacktop is good for roller skating. So this is the kind of reasoning we would like our system to do in order to answer these questions. Here's question 3. A student puts 2 identical plants in the same type and amount of soil. She gives them the same amount of water. She puts one of these plants near a sunny window and the other one in a dark room. This experiment tests how the plants respond to either light, air, water, or soil. So the answer here is, of course, light. Again, this is difficult for a machine. The word light is never mentioned in the question. Water and soil are mentioned in the question. And again, it requires knowledge about the world and some fairly sophisticated understanding about the scenario that the question is describing. The kind of knowledge that's needed is, for example, being near a sunny window means that you'll receive light. If you're in a dark room, then you won't get light. And also general knowledge about experiments, that if you want to test X's response to Y, you want to compare X with Y and X without Y and see what happens. So again, that's very challenging. And then finally, there are many questions which have diagrams in as well. So this is a typical question that occurs in the 4th grade exam. This is a picture of a food chain. So here the raccoons eat the frogs, eat the grasshoppers, eat the grass. And the question asks, if all the frogs died, the raccoon population would most likely decrease, increase, or remain the same. So the answer is decrease. Because if there's less frogs, there's less food for the raccoons, and so the raccoon population is going to go down. Again, very challenging for the machine. It requires some ability to do image processing to interpret the diagram, and then beyond that to actually construct some machine-sensible representation about what the diagram is trying to convey. It also requires understanding what the question is asking in some computer-sensible form, and then the ability to put these things together. So these just show all the challenges which arise in these type of questions. Suppose you wanted to build a system to answer these kind of questions. What kind of properties or basic building blocks would you need? So the work we've been doing is based on 3 fundamental conjectures that we're working with. So the first conjecture is that some form of inference is necessary, that these questions can't be answered just by comparisons and similarities, that there does need to be some type of representation within the machine. And then as soon as we say that, the question then becomes, well, where does the knowledge that this inferencing is going to operate over come from? So our second conjecture is that most of the inferential knowledge that we need is written down explicitly. And this is not just the scientific knowledge, but also the common sense knowledge that's needed. And then, of course, just having it written down is not enough to be able to do inferencing. We need to be able to convert it to some machine-sensible form. And so our third conjecture is that it can be extracted into some computational form with reasonable reliability. So that's the basis of a lot of what we're doing at AI2. And to show this kind of pictorially, we're taking text such as this, which comes from a science, 4th grade science study guide, with sentences like animals grow fur to help them stay warm. And we want to transduce this into some formal version, I've just written it here informally, of rules like these ones. For instance, if an animal grows fur, then it will stay warm, and then be able to use those for inferencing. So let me just put this in context of larger question answering systems. So this is a simple schematic of how Watson works. It was described earlier. But the main gist of it is, given a question, we extract candidate answers. We then score them using a wide variety of scoring algorithms. We combine those scores together and produce a ranked list of answers. In contrast, what we're trying to do is to take text, transduce it into some semi-structured form which allows inference to proceed, and then use some kind of lightweight reasoning mechanism in order to answer questions. And this, of course, will allow us to answer questions that go beyond things that are explicitly stated in text. And then just as another point of contrast, this is very different to the Psych project, where they've been working for several years, many years, to encode a lot of knowledge by hand. And their reasoning mechanism has largely been fairly heavy-duty deductive inference. And in this middle track here, the fundamental challenge we're dealing with is how to bridge the gap between text and inference. That is, how can we acquire representations that are both reasonably accessible at low cost and also are computable, that is, they can support inferencing. So what I'm going to do now is talk about 2 projects that we've had to do this. There are other projects as well that are going on within Aristo, but I'm just going to concentrate on these 2. The first is extracting rules, and the second is extracting and using table-based representations for question answering. So going back to this picture of taking text and generating rules, I do want to point out this is very different to the task of knowledge-based population, which has largely been working on extracting simple facts about named entities. For instance, Paris is the capital of France. Instead here, we're trying to extract more sophisticated structures about types of things and extract them in a form that the computer can then perform some inferencing with. And so we do this with three basic steps, and I'm going to briefly talk through those 3 steps. So the first is specification of the knowledge that's required. So the big question is, if we want to get knowledge, what exactly is the knowledge that we need? And so we've identified various classes of knowledge based on analysis of the question sets we're dealing with. So, and I'll illustrate this with this example here. So here, if we look at this question, a fox grows thicker fur as the season changes. This adaptation helps the fox to A, find food, B, keep warmer, C, grow stronger, D, escape from predators. And so here, of course, the answer is keep warmer. So what knowledge is required to answer this question? Well, when you look at it, it seems on the face of it that we need to know things about foxes and fur. But there's actually a deeper abstraction that underlies this question, namely, this is a question about purpose, in this case, the purpose of fur. But if we look at many questions, we find that knowledge about the purpose of things and the ability to manipulate and reason about those purposes is one class of knowledge which comes up a lot in science. So that would be one of our initial targets that we need, knowledge about purpose. What other types of targets do we have? So again, from these analyses we've done of our question sets, knowledge about cause and effect, so causality comes up a lot in reasoning about science. Knowledge about the requirements or conditions for an event to occur occurs a lot. Knowledge about enablements, what's required for an activity to proceed is used. Partonomic knowledge is used a lot, and taxonomic knowledge is required a lot. So these provide an initial set of targets for the kind of rule structures we want to get out of language. The second step, which I'll just summarize very briefly, is to identify where those different types of knowledge are expressed in language in a linguistic way. And this extraction is done by using a set of hand-coded and machine-learned extraction patterns developed by looking over our science texts to take text as input and identify when these different relationships are expressed in language and produce data structures which summarize the main elements of those expressions. So for instance, one of the results of the extraction might look like this. An animal eats food, causes animals to get nutrients. There's a lot more details to say about how this extraction works, but I'm just going to summarize it for this point. And at this point, there's no semantics associated with these things. These are just data structures. So the third step is to now transduce those extractions into some inference supporting representation, that is to add some semantics as to what they mean. So for this, we've been working with a subset of first order logic with certainties attached, and it's the kind of for all exists subset. So all the expressions that we produce have this quantifier pattern. And to illustrate this, a simple extraction like fruit contains seed would be converted into a rule that says, if there is a fruit, then it will contain a seed with some degree of confidence. This is what it looks like in our formalism. And then these more structured extractions like animal eats food, causes animal get nutrients, would be converted to a rule that says if an animal is eating, then the animal gets nutrients, again with some degree of confidence associated with it. And again, this is what this looks like in the formalism that we're using. And then we have a fairly simple reasoning engine that then works with this to compute whether an answer can be concluded from the body of a question. And let me just mention two very interesting and important features of this reasoning process. So the first is that you might have noticed on that previous slide, we don't map all the words and phrases to a full formal ontology. Rather, we retain words and phrases within the representation itself. So for instance, here the word animal is actually part of the representation of a rule about animals. And what this means is then at runtime, when we have particular questions to ask, we'll make runtime decisions about whether a word or a phrase mentioned in the question denotes an entity that's a type of entity denoted by the word animal in one of the rules we have. So, and this decision is made by offloading that ontology decision to an entailment service that we run separately. So for instance, the question about dogs would call the entailment service to say, well, is the thing that the word dog in the question refers to likely to be the same thing as the thing the word animal refers to in a rule? And that confidence then plays into the certainty calculation in the reasoning. And then the second thing, which is very important, is the system's reasoning is robust in the sense that it does a kind of soft reasoning. If some of the conditions of a rule are not satisfied, rather than just blocking the rule from applying, the system will continue its reasoning but with reduced confidence. And this is very, very important because it allows the system to sometimes jump gaps in its knowledge if there are some facts it can't conclude, yet there's still enough evidence otherwise to suggest with some degree of confidence that a conclusion could be drawn. So this is one module, this is one solver within the entire Aristo question answering framework. The full architecture looks like this. And the important thing here is to note there are 5 different solvers that are working together, similar to the ensemble architecture that Ray was describing earlier, to answer a question. These first 3 at the top are using retrieval and statistical techniques. I haven't said anything about that, and I won't say anything here. And the components I've just described is this rule-based components, the 4th one here. So how well does this perform? So we've run this system on 6 years of exams from the New York State. These are completely unseen questions for us. And looking at the non-diagram multiple choice questions, the statistical systems score about 65% on this data set. When we add in the rule system, we get a small improvement in the ensemble. It moves up to about 67.5%. So it's doing something, it's providing a small benefit. It's not massively raising the scores, but it's providing some useful signal there. And then perhaps more informatively, if we look at the questions which the statistical systems get right and the questions which the rule system get right, there's quite a difference in those sets. So these are the questions which the statistical systems are getting right. These are the rule system questions it gets right, and only about half of them are in common. So the rule system is answering a fair number of questions which are different to those that the statistical system is getting right. And that's very desirable for any ensemble system. So let me just give some reflections on this. And this is a project that we've worked on for quite a while, and it has some very interesting strengths and weaknesses. So a couple of the very good things, it's very cheap to extract a lot of science knowledge. And secondly, that knowledge can be put in an inference supporting form. So we can get these nice chains of reasoning, allowing us to sometimes answer questions which are clearly outside the scope of information retrieval or statistical methods. But there are some problems. First of all, the rules that we extract are still very noisy despite numerous methods we've used to try to reduce the noise. Secondly, a literal reading of the text can often be incorrect. So even if we get the extraction right, the original formulation can be kind of wrong. So for instance, this is a sentence in our textbook. It says, animals need air to survive. If we transduce this literally to a rule, we get, if animals need air, then the animals survive. So that clearly doesn't make sense as a reasoning method. So we get a number of errors like that. And then finally, which is also of concern, is even with lots of text, we end up with fairly patchy coverage of the space of knowledge that we need to answer the questions. And even worse, because we just have a giant sea of rules, there's no real organization to the knowledge. It's actually very difficult to even tell how much knowledge we're missing, how much we need. And so what that has led us to is to also look at another way of representing some of this science knowledge, namely in the form of tables. You can think of this as a more systematic organization of knowledge. So I'm going to briefly talk about this as a representation. So here's the Aristo architecture again, and now I'm just going to talk about this last reasoning engine that we use for answering science questions. Again, this is best illustrated with an example. So here's another 4th grade science question. In New York State, the shortest period of daylight occurs during which month? June, March, December, or September? So the answer here, of course, is December. This is a particularly interesting question because if we just make a small perturbation to it, if we change shortest to longest, or daylight to night, or New York to Australia, that flips the answer. So this is a question which really requires some sort of modeling about the entities here and their relationships in order to answer the question. So let's think about what kind of knowledge we need to answer this. Well, we need basic knowledge about geography and orbital events like the summer solstice and so on. So one bit of knowledge we need to know is that the winter solstice has the shortest day length. And then it's also useful to know that the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere occurs in June. And then we also need to connect New York State to the northern hemisphere. So there's some basic geography we need to know, that New York is in the USA and USA is in the northern hemisphere. So this is another way of thinking about the knowledge requirements for this question as a set of organized tables. And then, of course, there's a reasoning task of being able to stitch this information together. To acquire these tables, so we've built a separate repository of knowledge consisting of a large number of tables. Those tables are acquired using an interactive table building tool. I'm not going to say anything more about that here. For people who will be at the automatic knowledge-based construction workshop, we have a poster on that tool that's used to build these tables very quickly. I will just say quickly how the reasoning works on this. So the basic challenge when you have large tables of knowledge is essentially to say, is the knowledge that the question is asking for either expressed in a row in the table, or is it expressed in several rows of several tables that can be joined together? So you can think of this as a kind of matching or alignment process. So if we break that up, we want to say, can we align chunks in the question with cells in the tables? And can we align cells in one table with cells in the other table? And if we take some arbitrary set of alignments, we can sketch that as a graph. And the challenge here is to try and find the best graph that offers the best degree of support for a particular question. So we call this the support graph. There are many support graphs for a question. We want to find the best one and assess how good it is. So to do that, we can specify those characteristics of a good graph as a set of constraints. So for instance, just having a cell chunk aligning with one cell in one row doesn't really tell us anything. So we'd need to align with at least two cells. And then once we specify these constraints, we can use integer linear programming as an optimization technique to search the space of possible alignments that come up and find the best supporting graph. And then we'll pick the answer option with the best overall graph, and that will be the right answer. So this is the basis of the reasoning method that's used. And there's a paper in IJCAI coming up which describes that in more detail. Let me just illustrate that with this question again. So again, the same question, New York State, which month has the shortest day? So the system will align some of the answer options here and realize they occur in this table. And then it will also align words in the question with different parts of the different tables. And so it'll find these alignments here. And then here, New York State mentions USA. And so the system will also realize that USA here refers to the same thing as USA in this table. So New York's in USA, and then USA is in the Northern Hemisphere. Northern Hemisphere happens to be mentioned over here, talking about the winter solstice and the summer solstice. Winter solstice, though, happens to be mentioned in this table here, this row here, which is aligned with the question. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm building up a graph of connections and associations. And this particular alignment here, therefore, points to December as the right answer option. So this is the notion of a support graph. The system, using ILP, looks at the collection of all the support graphs that align the question with the tables and then picks the best answer. So how well does this perform when we give it our science exam? These are the results on the 6 years of exams, getting up to 64%. When we add in the table reasoning system, this increases the score up to 71%. So again, provides a good boost to the system. So this is really exciting for us to have systems which are dealing with statistical techniques, retrieval techniques, and a little bit of knowledge-based reasoning in order to answer questions. So I don't want to give the impression we can answer all the science questions. Essentially, I would characterize where we are as being able to answer science questions which require small amounts of reasoning, but there are many other challenges which still remain. I'll just mention a few of these. Vagueness, common sense knowledge, comparison questions, story questions, and spatial reasoning. These will remain formidable challenges that we're starting to look at now. And I'm just going to show you one question which encapsulates pretty much all of these. This is actually an 8th grade question, but I think it's very interesting, again, to show the challenges which come up. City administrators can encourage energy conservation by lowering parking fees, building larger parking lots, decreasing the cost of gasoline, or lowering the cost of bus and subway fares. So, any votes on the right answer here? Yeah. But you can see when you think through this, this is a very, very complicated question. You need to understand energy conservation, human behavior, economics, how these things all feed together. So, interesting question. We can't answer this question at the moment. We hope to be able to do so in years going forward. So let me just summarize here. Artificial intelligence, if we're interested in the big picture of machines that can reason, requires a lot more than factoid QA. And what I've tried to show here is that science exams are a fantastic test bed for exploring this. And as I said at the beginning, there are many challenges, but the real challenge is building representations that are both acquirable and computable. So again, showing this graph here, this little icon here, having representations that can be acquired semi-automatically, yet can still be processed with tractable reasoning. So I'd encourage everybody here to take a step towards real AI and have a go. We have a lot of data, a lot of question sets on our website. We now have, I think, 1,700 science questions, both multiple choice, direct answer, diagrams and no diagrams. Fantastic set to experiment with. I would encourage you to have a look. And that's it. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting work. I was wondering, so you presented the IR text approach and the reasoning approach as opposites and contrasts. But there's also the possibility that you leave the knowledge in the text, and then you have very complicated machinery that directly goes to the text and tries to do the inference for a particular question. Because one of your examples was animal and eat, and of course eat is a very ambiguous word, so you may have to go back to the text where you extracted that knowledge to understand what eat meant in that context.
Right.
So could you comment on this alternative approach of leaving the knowledge in the text and then referring to it?
Right. So certainly the issue of context is very important. And one thing we've found when we distill out the rules is that we often need some of the contextual information of the text where the rules came from in order to answer questions. So now we're working on associating the rules, well, keeping the provenance of the rules attached to the original text, and then using that as part of the rule selection mechanism and the confidence assessment mechanism to decide not just does this rule apply, but does the context seem to match the context of the question, and then use that to modify the uncertainty. To your point about could you just reason directly with the language, I view what we created with our rules as kind of something which is not quite a full logic, and it's not quite reasoning with the original text. It's this kind of hybrid in that we have words and phrases embedded within the representation. There are different points along this spectrum. So Chris Manning, for instance, has done work on natural logic inference, where the basic representation is even more textual. It's essentially a dependency tree, and so let's reason with dependency trees. That's all we need. And there's this trade-off that the more you get to the text, the easier it is to acquire, but then the more, as you say, the more complex it is in the reasoning and the manipulation that's needed. So I'd say our rule system is kind of one data point, trying to bridge that balance.
So thanks for the great talk, and it's such a meaningful task to tackle. So I had a question about the inference rule part, and I was wondering what you guys do for generalization? Like, so you read a sentence like, I ate a really fatty meal and it's unhealthy or something like that. And then you have, multiple other sentences that a fatty burger like causes something. Do you have any way of like generalization of the rules and knowing what to drop, like what modifiers to keep?
So there's two parts there. So one is we don't have any mechanism that will take a lot of specific rules and kind of induce a general rule from it. Rather, we're relying on the fact that generalization will be stated in the text somewhere. So there will be rules that say, dogs eat, cats eat, elephants eat, but then somewhere there would be a rule which says animals eat. So we're, at least for the rule system, we're relying on that generalization to be stated explicitly. We are doing some experimental work as well, collecting a large database of ground facts and looking for those generalizations that can emerge. So for instance, actually on that example, we can take a lot of examples about animals and say, using tensor completion methods to say, it seems to be the case that most things that animals eat, so maybe that generalization animal is also applied, and we can say animals eat.
So I had a question about another aspect of context, which is that there's a sort of pedagogical context as well. So in the highly ambiguous and vague and complex example at the end, that looks probably a little bit more tractable if you happen to know that in the 8th grade science they're going to be stressing that public transportation is better than individual transportation. So if that's a kind of a salient fact, that a student, that I can easily imagine that question was designed to sort of exercise that piece of information, to enable a student to practice with it. So it's a sort of a background theory, but it's also something that you might imagine being particularly salient in the context of that question.
Right, and actually that's a great observation. So certainly, as you look at a textbook, textbooks are divided into different topics and chapters, and so you could view a textbook as not just presenting a long list of facts, but they're presenting a series of models about the world. There's a model about this is how earthquakes form, and then there's another one about volcanoes. So that's certainly something we're looking at. Can we take a question, classify the topic which it's about, and then use knowledge that was extracted about that topic? So in that last example, for instance, I'm not sure maybe there's some chapter, that's not one we've studied in detail, but maybe there's a chapter about human behavior and energy conservation where there's been an explicit model taught in a chapter in the book. And if we can identify that's the right model to bring to bear, that would make that question a lot more amenable to being answered. Yeah, context is very important. And that division into topics is a large part of that.
All right, that's all the time we have. Let's thank the speaker again.